I'm Laura Chessin. I'm faculty in the School of the Arts at Virginia Commonwealth University in the Graphic Design Department. I've taught typography classes for a couple decades at this point and have set type in everything from wood and metal to photo and digital. I've only recently begun to design type and have been working on a font for the past 10 months or so with a brilliant mentor. So shout out to Troy Leinster. The original title for this talk was more of a question, a way of exploring how a seemingly open-ended experimental body of work under the umbrella term Asemic, how this might possibly connect to some unexpected places in my practice. I'll share this brief introduction. So to start, the term asemic is commonly defined as having no semantic content. I came across this body of work when I was doing a set of drawings that for me were purely about the gesture of drawing. At the time, I was teaching a class with a dancer and a poet. We would combine a movement exercise with a drawing exercise and explore how ideas of movement and space translated to marks on a page. One text we used is Deborah Hayes' My Body the Buddhist. She writes of the body as a contradiction of form and commitment, an instrument for asking questions. I practice remembering, she writes, the rightness of nothing much, including absurdity in the choice, to surrender anything that wants definition. On the other hand are the rigor, exactitude, and the thrillingly subtle music of the moving body. Dancers understand embodiment in a way that those of us maybe who work too often at a keyboard or mouse may not. So I began to think about this work again recently when I picked this scrap of paper up off the ground on a walk. It's led me to the question, is there something more to this work than just aesthetics? I began to question if there was a key to this work that somehow allowed me to connect some seemingly disconnected parts of my life. So if I were to revise the title of this presentation based on my preparation for it, I might retitle it Asemic Writing, Banjos, and Hambone. Okay, so to get back to Asemics, 1997, poets Tim Gaze and Jim Leftwich are credited with defining this term asemic to a body of work that they were exploring. They were digging into the way we read or don't read, interpret or don't interpret. Tim Gaze writes, "It looks like writing, but we can't quite read it. I call works like this asemic writing." So to give you a couple examples of what this work looks like, this is from Cecil Touchon. Palimpsest, he writes, Asemic poem number 2011.006 in his cataloging of his work. Another piece by Cecil Touchon. This work is often cited as an example. This is from the poet and visual artist Henri Michaux, titled Narration Excerpt from 1927. Another piece by Henri Michaux, translated loosely as By Way of Rhythms, dated as late as 1974. And this piece by current artist Mary Louise Moreno. Moreno spent some time in Japan studying Japanese calligraphy. She conducts these experiments that she refers to as asemic writing. Twombly is often cited. His work is often cited as examples of asemic writing. This piece, Untitled, from 1970, Twombly's work often crosses boundaries from painting to mark making to multimedia textures and works. So Tim Gaze describes asemic writing as something that's been made by poets, writers, painters, calligraphers, children, and scribblers all around the world. Most people make asemic writing, he says, at some time, possibly when testing a new pen. So I keep this piece from my then 5-year-old son tacked on my board as a reminder of the very early way in which we connect line, rhythm, the way we arrange marks on a page, sometimes to convey an idea, sometimes as pure play. And this piece I found in a box of scraps. Again by Henri, the mark of a gesture with a beginning and an end, almost like the vibration of a note that hangs in the air. Maybe you can even imagine the way a child's marker lands on the page, completes the line. Some texts on asemic writing reference the surrealists, Klee, Kandinsky, Michaux, suggesting a motivation of the subconscious. This useful text from MoMA explains that the surrealists borrowed many of the same techniques to stimulate their writing and art, referencing the work of Freud and the other psychoanalysts, with the belief that the creativity that came from deep within a person's subconscious could be more powerful and authentic than any product of conscious thought. This is The Castle and Sun by Paul Klee, who made these wonderful connections between color and music. The Black Frame from Kandinsky, and Miro's El Sol. So another effort to see meaning in this work draws a connection to existentialism. Sloan writes, Asemics is deeply rooted in existentialism, as in philosophy, and even rooted in the nihilistic views of language in late and remote corners of postmodernism. I do not mean to imply this is a disappointment or failure of asemics. I am very intrigued by this counter-vision of asemics, he writes. Some discussions reference fictional texts. This codex by the Italian artist and architect and industrial designer Luigi Serafini, originally published in 1981, this is an illustrated encyclopedia of an imaginary world, written in an imaginary language. And this by Tolkien, for you Hobbit fans. Quenya, a constructed language Tolkien created for the elves in Middle-earth. So Gaze gives us a little bit of insight into the vast open-endedness of this work, giving us an exhaustive list of potential examples and tie-ins. Concrete poetry, he says, controlled scribbles, Jean Dubuffet, the painter, doodles, illegible writing, ideograms, André Masson, automatic drawings, mock letters, Taoist magic diagrams, and of course Crazy Zhang, wild cursive. Gaze explains that meaning lies with the viewer. Some examples he suggests give meaning through their shape. We like some, we dislike others, he writes. They tend to have no fixed meaning. The meaning is open. Every viewer can arrive at a personal, absolutely correct interpretation. For me, much of the literature and critique addresses issues of meaning, or not meaning, of interpretation and open-endedness. And this brings me to the crux of my presentation, because what grabs my attention is the actual act of writing, which is a physical, kinesthetic act, something that exists in time and space. Sam Wolf, another blogger, turns the mirror back to the impulse itself, not the reading or the reader, but the maker, he writes. I point to the paradoxical nature of this art form. The marks involved are at once meaningless and meaningful, since as an art form there can be meaning behind their creation, the intention, emotion, or state of mind expressed. But maybe even closer to what I'm getting at, the content of asemic writing is meaningless, period. It is void as a signifier that failed to make its way to its signified, putting this in the context of semiotics. But Ekaterina goes on to say, it is not meaningless as an act, as a gesture. So this brings me to how I see value in this work. One primary takeaway for me is the emphasis on the gesture, the physical act of the mark making on the page, the sound of the tool on the paper or the substrate, the feel of the tool in the hand. At a drawing conference a few years back, I introduced the connection between movement and mark making. What I love about this clip is the connection between the sound and the actual marks. Note the ambient noise of another's mark making in the background. A different sound, a different gesture. So we began with a few basic movements around the room, and then the participants began to explore a way to record physical movement. So listen carefully to the sounds of traces inside the room. This piece is much like the interaction of musical instruments, maybe a recording of alternating hands with alternating marks. Consider the drawing of the enso as a practice of Zen Buddhism, drawn as a single unbroken gesture. The form is both form and formless, empty and complete. The perfection of intention, gesture, and mark. So another takeaway for me is the concept of embodiment. In my initial proposal, I referred to the ecstatic practices of Sufi whirling dervishes. Whirling is a form of meditation practiced as worship to reach the source of all perfection, or karma. This ecstatic gesture is said to unite one with the planetary circle of the universe. Less a mark or permanent trace, but rather pure resonance, pure kinesthetic embodiment of spiritual connection. So if any of you are familiar with the work of Ewan Clayton, here's one of his interpretations of a text by the Sufi poet Rumi. Clayton, of course, is a master designer, and with this he embodies his work through gesture, spiritual practice, and mark making, as well as genuine generosity. I think of Clayton's gesture of kindness as he writes this inscription in a treasured publication for me many, many years ago. So thank you, Ewan. That gesture still resonates to me even today when I'm in the classroom. Along with gesture and embodiment, rhythm is what I return to as a core of this work. So return to this issue of banjos and hambone. One of the things that got me through the pandemic was playing music with friends. So I've played fiddle since I was a kid. This summer I took my first banjo lesson, and it was something about rhythm that allowed me to think about making music in a really different way. And I began to understand rhythm in a deeper way as the glue that really binds everything together, especially as a melody player. So I began to understand rhythm as a structure that allows for the melody to live. So it's rhythm that holds everything in place. So ham bone, it's a practice attributed to African Americans in the southern U.S. It's an example of how intimately our bodies recreate rhythm. It's an embodiment of rhythm. So the first assignment this semester in my typography class was an exercise in rhythm. I'm guessing this is probably familiar to many of you, if not most of you. So each student has a unique rhythm, a signature style of the basic stroke.
No.
So last week in class, they began to explore issues of legibility and texture. And this week we'll continue with these studies. By the time I'm actually showing this, they will have begun to digitize their work, exploring rhythm and texture as underlying principles, we hope. This student scribbles in his textbook, a sketchbook constantly, and for him, he's found a way to give that scribbling some validity. This student's comfortable playing with shape even before she thinks of the construction of form. Again, thinking about just playing before she begins to actually build systems. And this student is trying to recreate the topography of the rice fields in Vietnam, where she is from. So to wrap up, for a year and a half, we conducted all of our classes online. Many of you have as well, maybe. Many of my students I met for the first time as a face in a little box. I'm a face in a little box to you now. I'm drawn to this body of work because it highlights for me a way of thinking about text and typography, which is, of course, about form, but also about the embodiment of language and expression and gesture. These are the things that we lost and just now are reclaiming in the studio and maybe in our own work. The other thing is the basic affordance of exploring this body of work is the value placed on responsiveness. Each mark is a response to the one before and a response to the page and the space in which the mark is made. These are the things I find compelling and maybe a way to bring life to the way we put text on the page or onto the screen. Thanks a lot.